Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of the Math IES Summit. My name is Joleigh, and I serve on the executive board of the Conference Board of Mathematical Sciences. I am going to be serving on the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics starting this fall, and I'm very excited about that. In fact, I guess by the time this shows up, it'll be in just a month. And I am also an author and consultant for Open Up High School Resources and Mathematics Vision Project. And recently, I also served at the Utah State Board of Education as the Math Equity Specialist and Math Specialist, and did a lot of work for supporting students with disabilities and also multilingual learners. And today, I am excited to share with you strategies for differentiating instruction for diverse learners. So we're going to get started talking about our learning intentions and success criteria today. Our learning intentions is that we will utilize the major focus of grade beyond concepts to leverage student success, understand how to create and advocate for asset-based individual education plans that empower diverse learners, and use asset-based routines to support all of our learners, including multilanguage and students with disabilities. In the end, we're really going to talk about what are strategies that we want to use to increase access for all students, both access to grade level content, access to the classroom of general education students. We will also talk about engagement. What are strategies that we use that you can use writings, drawings, as well as verbally and speaking, writing, that sort of thing. And then also, how do we make sure that we have relevance? Relevance for all learners, but also more specifically relevance for diverse learners. So let's start with this slide. And where should we start instruction? And some people think of differentiation and supporting diverse learners as being about modifying specific daily lesson plans to meet students where they're at. And so consider this chart. We've all seen data that indicates a student or a group of students are underperforming. And, we've heard this phrase, my students are blank, 1, 2 grade levels behind. And so when we have the conversation about our students being a grade level behind, we should also be thinking about how it makes sense when people say that. So when we're looking at data that compares where they have scored and where their students and so maybe that score has been somewhere like where our little red skittle is, or maybe even where the blue one is. And then we want to compare that to where we anticipate students should be, which maybe it's our little yellow candy. Often the data includes a goal of where all students should be by the end of the year, and in this case, let's say that where they should be is the orange candy. These are the goals of the particular year. So for years, we've talked about start where the student's perceived knowledge is based on data. We think about our present levels of academic achievement and performance, also known as the PLAF in special ed, or PLAF. But the conversation about starting where the student's perceived knowledge is and work towards the yellow and then the orange, think about the problem with this logic. It's multifaceted. First, it implies students can't learn grade level content without first mastering all kinds of concepts in prior years. Second, it sounds like the work of the teacher is to take students who are labeled as struggling in the red and place them on a path that accelerates their learning at twice the rate of their peers, of their general education peers. They're supposed to learn twice as much in the same amount of time, which is to catch them up to grade level. And we know that that doesn't happen. And in fact, what the data tells us is the third, which is what happens most of the time. Our students only get further behind. But at high school, we're often stuck learning fractions and computation or other concepts that are far below grade level. So I want us to think about, instead of starting where their data is saying that they have, that might be 1 or 2 or however that this is where they are, and then think about what are the things we do to build them up. I want us to start thinking about it that way. And I want us to start thinking about start the year with with the most important grade level content and provide just in time supports as needed. What we're talking about is understanding that math is a web of ideas and that using asset based instruction makes it so that we are providing students access to grade level content and then supporting and scaffolding them as needed over time. So, if you were with me last week, you probably recognize we were talking about this other part, this takeaway of starting with the most important grade level content, but also it means knowing what the major work is. So, I don't want to just start with grade level content. If I'm in third through fifth grade, I am hoping that teachers are starting with right away talking about multiplication and division because that understanding and representing the relationship in those is the most important thing in third through fifth grade, along with developing an understanding of fractions. So there are big ideas that go across grade bands. In high school, we have three big ideas. We're thinking about algebraic representations. We're thinking about functions and the interactions of characteristics and definitions of functions and understanding those definitions of functions. And then we're also thinking about geometry concepts. And number sense and statistics also fall within those spaces, but they can also be addressed within these big ideas. So today we are going to also look at how we're going to understand, compare, and represent functions. And if you were with me last week, this is also a very similar space that we were in, as looking at how we want to think about students making sense of problems, students first learning about multiple representations and how to create them, and then over time using them as tools to make sense of the mathematics that they're working on. So we're going to use the major work of the grade, and we are going to talk about this in the space of diverse learners. But first, last week, if you got to hang out with me, we talked about the task of growing tots, and we talked about the takeaway two is that we need to implement tasks that provide multiple entry points to align to the most important grade level content. Last week, we looked at different ways students see this figure grow. We looked at different representations, and we talked about how students are learning from each other and building on each other's knowledge. And this week, we're going to do something similar, but we're going to talk about how not only is it important to create access for students by having low floor, high ceiling tasks that provide multiple entry points, but also that students need multiple opportunities over time. So it is not like students just got to see growing dots one day and then it's like, okay, now you should be an expert on arithmetic sequences or linear functions. It's like, no, they need multiple opportunities. And then this is what we also talk about when we are talking about students, that as they make sense of, as they develop these connections, that they are also building their procedural fluency from this conceptual understanding. So let's check out Scott's workout. Scott has decided to do an exercise routine, and he's adding push-ups to this regiment, and he is keeping track of the push-ups in the given bar graph. So he likes having a visual. So on the first day, the bar graph you can see has 3 boxes. On day 2, there's 5. And then you can see that he has 3 on day 3, and then day 4, he's continuing this pattern of increasing the number of push-ups. So what I'd like for you to do is think about what are the things that you notice with him doing these push-ups, and how many push-ups would he do on day 5, day 6, and day 10? And so I want you to have just a moment to be thinking about that, and I'm going to be quiet. And if you even have time and you have a little bit of paper, jot down some quick ways that you're thinking about this problem and how this pattern grows. So if we were in class and not having this short period of time, um, I would also make sure that I'm sharing with you that our goals are to make connections. So last week, we just wanted to be like, how is this pattern growing and what are different ways that we see it? We got representations out. We started talking about the difference between explicit and recursive. And we also were starting to make connections. Today, I would say our goals are to create different representations and to see what connections we can make between those representations. And in that situation, if this was some of the student work that I saw or that we saw as we were monitoring, of course, we would ask students to share their thinking and to provide information for us in the chat box. I would love for you to talk about what we are seeing and what we value about what the different students are sharing in these different representations. So in the chat box, will you please put table and then something you want to add, or graph and something, or bar graph, geometric model, something you want to add? Please place that in the chat box. And even during my recording, I can be like, "Ooh, nice job. Thanks for putting that information in the chat box, everyone." Um, and I really think that I am appreciating, we are sharing what students are understanding about this problem. The students are seeing that 2 days. And we can see that, +2, +2. I'm really liking in the table that they're showing that rate of change. And I'm also appreciating the bar graph that I can visually see it, like they're making their thinking visible and really supporting students in learning how to make their thinking visible and praising them for when they are doing that. I'm not praising them because of the +2, although I am grateful for that. What I'm praising them for in this situation is thank you for making your thinking visible, because that helps them to develop that. And over time, they get better and better at showing their understanding, not just getting an answer. Um, and so I'm praising them for their effort, not their answers in this situation. Here is more student work. And I would love for you to also, Scott starts on day one with 3 push ups. What are the different things you're noticing here about the way students are thinking? And what are we appreciating? What are the students making sense of? And then, for the sake of our conversation, here's one more. And you do not have to put anything in the chat box on this, but just kind of highlighting that there are still just different ways that students are seeing the pattern grow, different ways that students are representing their table of values, and lots of rich opportunities for us as teachers for us to take this work that students are doing and have students explain their thinking and reasoning and how they're making sense of this and connecting it to the work of others. This is equitable access to content. And it is where we are inviting and the support and active engagements of all students talking about disciplinary content. And it is where we are having students share ideas with each other as they are working on this, that makes it so that students working together in partners and small groups are not making it so that one or two students are getting all the airtime, but that all students are sharing their strategies. Notice that in this work, students are encouraged to communicate with their partners, but they can do so by showing their drawings, showing their numerical table of values, if you will. It does not have to be that students are writing things out, although they can. But it is much more about students being able to share their thinking as we go through this process. Again, equitable access to content. We see that students have choice and voice in the work that they are doing. They are choosing how they're making sense of the content. They're choosing what strategies they're using. And then for student voice, they are talking about the discourse of how they're seeing the problem. No one is telling them that they must start with a table or that they must start with a graph or that they must do any particular thing. And at this point in time, when we worked together last week with Growing Dots, students were using whatever came up for them. And then now that they're on, this is actually their third task after that, we're now getting to the place where hopefully they're generating and that they themselves are now making connections um, between that work. So having students being able to walk the walk and talk the talk in being able to contribute to others' ideas and have others listen to their ideas and thinking about how this is developing their agency, or in other words, their willingness to engage, gives them the ownership over the content. So it is not the teacher owning the content and giving it to students as much as it is this teacher setting up the situation to position students as the owner of the content. And as a result, students develop a more positive math identity. So takeaway 4 is using those routines that promote learner agency and identity. And if you were not able to hang out with us last week, I encourage you to go look and listen and talk and hear about all the different types of discourse moves. Of course, there are many more than this, but we really honed in on the 5 practices and how those practices are a culmination of many awesome routines that support students in having ownership of the mathematics, but that we also have think, pair, share kinds of routines and math language routines. And why these are all important is because our students who are learning English, so our multi-language learners and our students with disabilities, and I'm going to say other marginalized student groups who have perhaps in the past not seen themselves as having the potential or capability of achieving at high levels in mathematics, one of the things we really want to do is we really want to empower every student. So takeaway 5 is, how are we cultivating student genius? How are we looking at what students do know as opposed to what they don't know or what they're missing? So in Scott's push-ups, I want to go back just a little bit. So excuse me for a moment because we're going to go back here and just look at this. And what you'll notice is that Scott, he started doing push-ups on day 1 and he did 3 push-ups. In the context of the situation, there really is not a day 0, but the teacher does not have to address that there's not a day 0. The point is that how are students making sense of the problem? How are they getting out the ideas? How are they recognizing that +2? And then notice that the student on the bar graph where they have their 2 that are visible, they wrote recursive, and that they wrote that it's previous +2. So this term, if I want to find the next term, I'm going to say it's previous +2. Those are things that that student can talk about and can address while they're sharing. And then the teacher during the takeaways can add more notation and make sure that like students are getting more comfortable with how to use the notation. But the student who is writing P+2 and recognizing that it's recursive and it has a +2 is something to be highlighted and valued in the conversation. And the teacher doesn't need to mention that, like what a teacher does not mention is just as important as what they are focusing on. So not highlighting that there is a day 0 or that there's not a day 0, excuse me, is just as important as highlighting what the students know. In the end, We want students to develop their reasoning and sense making skills. So really listening for what students know as opposed to what they're missing is key. Also, listening for what students know allows us to position the students as the owners of their learning. It makes it so that when students have shared all of their ideas and different students have been selected and shared the ideas and the connections are made in class, that at the end of the lesson, the teacher can pull out those key takeaways that are connected to the goals, which, by the way, our goals are connected to those core disciplinary ideas that are grade level. Notice that in this situation, students from growing dots, and now we're looking at Scott's push-ups. These are just two tasks that are building on the understanding of arithmetic sequences and their connections to linear functions. What's powerful about this is we're not talking about interventions at this time. We are still creating space and time for students to make sense of and use different representations. Students are coming to the table with with what they know. And by the way, students with disabilities can definitely talk about, I can see 3 push-ups, 5 push-ups, 7 push-ups, 9 push-ups. They can count the blocks, they see the +2, they can go 3, 5, 7, 9. Those things are something that we talk about having, all students having access to it. And then over time, we're looking to see how are they doing, and what are they getting better at, what are they not understanding. But intervention has not come into play yet. So step 5, or takeaway 5, is to learn and embrace diverse learners' strengths to cultivate their student geniuses. So when you're creating IEPs, which, by the way, I'm not sure if you do this or not in your role, but I will say that one of the things that special education teachers and groups are really excited about is the conversation of IEPs being written by groups of people, not by the special ed teacher. The special ed teacher is so busy doing so many things. The IEP should be co-crafted by the team. And I will say, as the content expert, really advocating for students' IEP goals not being about solving word problems. By the way, if your IEP goals are solving word problems, change that, because that could be any grade level. Have your IEP goals be something like that they understand, represent, and compare functions in, and then you could actually say, whatever your grade level happens to be. In Algebra 1, it would be linear, exponential, quadratic. If you do secondary math 1, it would be linear and exponential functions. But by doing this, we can really create lots of different opportunities for students to um, have their agency be recognized by giving them voice and choice. And also, when students are doing this work, we can collect data on their strengths. If you have not read Strengths-Based Teaching and Learning by Karp and Karen Karp and Beth Cobett, I highly recommend it. They also have this wonderful, beautiful family guide. And even though it says it's for K-8, I love the family guide that they have. It's actually available online, that really talks about how to support student strengths. Those strengths can be what you're using in the PLAFA. So what are the students' dispositions? What are their skills? Maybe they are really good at highlighting the connection between a geometric model and a table of values. Like, those kinds of things can be their present levels of, think about the data that you want to collect that supports them with the present level, that supports them learning grade level content. Also, make sure that your goals are really clear. Include specific concepts and skills to master. So those clarity of goals can be that I want students to compare and understand and use representations of functions, but also the skills and concepts that you want them to master are thinking about, how do I have them use representations? And how do those representations How do they make sense of those so that they can better define what makes something linear? That first difference, for example, in a table of values, or that you have a line, or that you can see that your cursive equation has a plus constant difference. With the geometric sequence or an exponential function, students can actually recognize that their first difference has a constant ratio, that their output values are increasing, so that their graph looks curved. Um, anyway, as students go through, the goals aligning to grade level and then having the concepts and skills are what are the things that we want students to do to have access to those goals. And then also make sure that we are talking about these goals as a strengths based, focusing on what students do know and what they bring to the table as opposed to what they don't know. And then also in the end, make sure that we are focusing on those grade level core standards. We just talked about having multiple opportunities over time as the takeaway. And I also want to share with you that when you are thinking about IEPs and you are talking about IEPs, for every part of an IEP that has compliance to it, I want you to think about what are some reflective questions that we are using so that we support students with grade level access, so that we support students in what they bring as opposed to what they don't bring to the table. And how are we also thinking about reflective questions that support their accommodations that are specific to them? I really appreciate the conversation that we are about to have, because one of the things is that we want to make sure, the conversation we're about to have with our question and answer, but on the takeaways, start instruction with the most important grade level content, implement tasks that provide multiple entry points, and then also not just one task, but over time provide multiple opportunities so that students build procedural fluency from conceptual understanding. Make sure there's equitable access. Do your tasks have low floor, high ceiling? And then also, how are we using asset-based instructional routines that encourage students to have quality discourse, not chaotic or not unproductive conversations that are not going anywhere, but intentional conversations that help them learn from one another about the mathematics that they have. And then finally, how do we provide students with multiple opportunities over time before we move them to having tier 2 supports or other interventions? Thank you so much. I'm really excited for us to talk about any questions and answers and just have a great conversation for the next few minutes. Please note, 3 big ideas from this is grade level content, using instructional routines, and thinking about how those things support us with implementing material for our diverse learners. And then also, how do we better support IEP goals? Please email me if you have any questions or you want to continue the conversation. This is something I'm super passionate about. Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to the session today. And then also thanks to those who are watching the session a little bit later on chat. I would love to hear from people in the room today. If there was a takeaway, if you wouldn't mind putting that in the chat box, or if there are any questions that you have. My background is that I have been in math education this is my 30th year. I have been a classroom teacher, a coach, a specialist, and I also want to share that for the past 5 years, I've really spent a lot of time understanding special education law and supporting teams of teachers working on IEP goals. And one of the things that we've really been focusing on and shifting in our work is that when we write IEP goals, that we do so in a way that focuses on grade level content first. So as opposed to being like, what do students not know? When we are looking at their PLAFIP, we focus more on their strengths, and it might be that they are good at using manipulatives. I think I saw Paralee put something about manipulatives in the chat box earlier. We also talk about like, do they make connections between representations? Someone also put earlier, like, where do you see the two in the bar graph showing up compared to the table? Um, so I'm just curious as to what questions you may have, and or if you are using IEPs or working with IEP teams, like what that looks like. I think another thing when I was talking about working with teams with IEPs is that when we start with grade level content and focus on what students know, um, it makes it so that students can use their background knowledge, whatever that happens to be, and build on some of their deficits or some of the things that they may not bring with them. And if you saw Steve's keynote this morning, that conversation around what are the goals, how are we having students share their thinking with each other, how are they talking about things so that they see themselves in the work. And it's really important that they do see the relevance of the mathematics that they're doing. And that relevance should be including things that where they themselves have experiences, but it also can be things that are similar in their experience that they are connecting with new things. Um, anyway, I appreciate you all being here. And also, if there's anything you'd like to share or anything you'd like to put in the chat box, that would be awesome. And Paralee, I love that you're talking about they're done as a team and required participation of two teachers. I I also think it's really powerful to have the special education teacher there who works with students and may even be a little bit more familiar with like what their home strengths are as well as what their in-school strengths are, that the parents like using the idea of um, what what are the strengths students have at home, like do they take, what are the ways that they take initiative, or what are the things that they do like that they love doing. And but I also think it's so important for the general education teacher, and for other specialists to be there who can say, you know, in third grade, we really focus on the idea of understanding the relationship between multiplication and division. Whereas in ninth grade, in Algebra 1, we are really looking at all of the characteristics of a linear function, as well as characteristics of exponential and quadratic functions in algebra, or if you're in integrated, and whether you're algebra or integrated in high school, really thinking about how those two functions are similar and how they are different, is a big idea. And having students have access to thinking about what that looks like in different representations, like a table or a graph, really makes a difference in how they understand the mathematics that they're learning. And then Cynthia, I love that and so agree. And I really do think that that students do open up when they have the confidence, and by confidence, I'm going to say the humble confidence, not like the arrogant confidence, but like being curious about things, wondering about things, interacting with one another, and sharing their ideas. I think that that's really, really important. One of the things that I said about discourse in here that I would also like to add is that I also think that think, pair, share is a low risk space, but I also think that sometimes for students, making sure that when they go to do the think, pair, share, that we are really clear about what we want them to think about, not that we are giving them an answer or stealing their joy, but that we're like, I want you to look at this geometric pattern and I want you to pay attention to what you notice mathematically. And I want you to write some things down that you notice mathematically. And maybe it's even, and how else can you represent this table? What are the different, graphs, equations, table, um, and I said table, so not that. But Cynthia earlier wrote, when I'm looking at this graph, I just wanted, like when I was looking at the bar graph, I just wanted to draw a line across the top and how that can be a real visual for students. So really, I just love the whole like, how do we use what students bring with them to move their thinking forward? Thanks, you guys. Thank you so much for putting things in the chat box. I'm gonna say, like, sitting in this space, it really means a lot to me that you are putting your ideas and sharing what you do in the chat box is important since we can't see each other. And Cynthia, I think that also when you said they really open up when teachers utilize their strengths as learning tools, I think that when students also recognize that you're using their strengths and valuing what they are saying or what they are doing, it also helps give them that confidence. I really, yeah. And I think you may have even said making that process explicit as well. Um, Apparently, I think is similar to what I was saying. So maybe you even put that in as we were talking about that. But thank you. Yeah, being specific about the task is not limiting. Like we want to, I call it like when we launch a task that we want to share and make sure expectations are there and students know what they're supposed to be doing. But we definitely don't want to steal the joy. Like in Scott's workout, when we were sharing that there, we don't show where we see the +2 happening. That's something that students do. We don't talk about how in the table of values you can see the +2 that's there. That's something that I want students to be looking at and making sense of and working on as they're working on their understanding. And then when we come back as a whole group, when different students are sharing those things, then those connections are made, and that's where we get to value the work that they do. um, and I do love that. It's like, yeah, we want think pair share to give expectations, be explicit, and we also want them to be able to move forward, right? There's that sweet spot, as Peter Liljedahl talks about in that flow. Like we want there to be challenge. We want them to have some good, productive work happening or some productive struggle, but we also don't want them to be productive struggling to the place where they're floundering or they're not sure what they're supposed to be doing. So love it, love it, love it. So my understanding is that we have about 1 minute left. I want to thank you again so much for coming and for being here today. And I also want to share with you is that when I am doing this work and I'm talking about writing IEP goals and then also having students having experiences centered on those big ideas, and then I want them to be able to talk about it and then also talk towards those goals, I think it's really important that we are also choosing tasks that have those access points that it's like, what do you notice? What are the things that you're having there? It's like, I think that Paralee, as you're saying this, I really appreciate it. It's like when the students don't know how to do something, I'm more curious as to what is it that they're grappling with and get to the core of that and make sure they have access to that thing as opposed to modeling, say, for example, the process. Like maybe the student needs to do a 3 reads, or like the group wants to do a 3 reads. Or perhaps like you want to use another language routine where you're kind of like, okay, let's do a sentence frame. The connect and display is a great example of a language routine of collecting some different things that are going on and then talk about how are these things similar and how are they alike and then also how are they different. Those things can help also, as opposed to a teacher just having to go straight to the telling. Anyway, thank you again. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for participating in the chat box. I really super appreciate that, and enjoy the rest of your session. I'll see you later.